I'm Damian Collins. I was until Thursday the Bill Minister for the Online Safety Bill. As many of you will know, I've been following the progress of this piece of legislation. I chaired the pre-led scrutiny period of the bill in second half of 2021, and was previously quite engaged on these issues when I chaired the DCMS Select Committee. So it's a pleasure to be here and talking about the bill, which is, I hope, now in its final months of legislation, as we eagerly await its return to the floor of the House of Commons. So it's a good time to be talking about it, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Jon. I'm here from Ofcom. Sharon, I remember actually we had two other former Love Island contestants appear in front of the DCMS Select Committee when I was chair of it, talking about abuse online, actually. So it's great that you're here. And Parven as well. I think the child safety aspect of the bill is often the bit that is the most important, but often it's not the thing at the moment we've been talking about most. But a lot of the recent debate around, the balance between legal and harmful speech, it really is that's a debate about content accessible by adults, but not children, and where the provisions are much tougher and necessarily so. So thank you all for joining us. I don't have a sort of particular running order of questions, but I wonder if I could ask Jon whether you could give us a point of view on one of the important questions of, is Ofcom ready?
Well, thanks very much, Damian. Well, I think the short answer is we're certainly working to be ready on time. So at the moment, this is a huge area of focus for us. We're sort of champing at the bit, really, to start regulating. We published a roadmap last July, setting out our plans for launch of the online safety regime. And there we set out that very shortly after the bill achieves royal assent, which we're assuming happens in spring of 2023, we're going to be ready to publish a consultation setting out our plans for how we're going to regulate in this space, including a draft code of practice on the steps that platforms will have to take to comply with their duties to address the most serious illegal harms. And preparing for that consultation is an absolute paramount focus for us at the moment. We've got a very substantial team of people working on it, and I'm confident that we'll be ready to move quickly once the bill passes. The other thing I'd note on that, we are also sort of furiously working to expand our operational capacity. So we now have a team of around 150 people in total, I believe, working on online safety issues, planning to grow that to 300 over the course of next financial year. And as part of our efforts to sort of skill up, we're focusing very hard on bringing expertise from industry, from civil society, etc., to make sure that we've got the expertise to hold the tech giants' feet to the fire, and really make sure that they are taking proportionate steps to tackle harm on their platforms. So, in summary, we're working very hard to be ready to move as soon as the bill passes.
That is good to hear, Sharon. By way of opening, I think a number of people who, through their work, become public figures as a consequence of being in the public eye, have talked about what that experience is like. And as I said, I've previously discussed it with other contestants from Love Island, and also a number of footballers in particular have recently been much more outspoken on this issue. It seems to me sort of unacceptable that people should have to live with high levels of abuse directed at them on a constant basis. That and actually to recognise in the real world, you can't just say, well, don't go on social media, because actually if you're a public person, often you have to be engaging with audiences through those channels. And what rights do you think people should have in that environment?
So personally, for me, when I've been talking about my experience about being online, the one comment I always get is that it's my fault because I put myself in the public eye, when actually, for me, online harassment and abuse and trolling started at the age of 14. So it's actually got nothing to do with my public profile as such. But I think one thing people always think about that it's acceptable to troll people online is because they're hiding behind a level of anonymity, and that they're actually not held accountable for what they say to people online. Actually, this is something I talk about quite often as a Vogue campaigner, but it's not just women that suffer with this problem. I know that a lot of male contestants as well suffer with a lot of unsolicited images that come through their social media platforms. I've said on Talking Pints of Nigel Farage, I probably receive on average about 3 a day. They're not nice to look at. They're never nice to look at, but it's something that you're told to kind of just put up with and deal with. And that's why I think the online safety bill is so important, because, you know, there's all these conversations about free speech, but at the end of the day, if somebody flashed at me in the street, that's an instant arrestable offence. And I don't have to sit there and question whether it's my fault for doing what I do for a living. So, you know, well, footballers is very different as well. The level of abuse they face online and face to face is quite disgusting, and that level I've seen from footballers receive is the same as that Love Islanders receive, especially when they're of people of colour as well. So a lot of my abuse is directed at the fact I'm a woman, I'm outspoken, and the fact that I'm a mixed race person of colour. So for me, this is why the online safety bill is super important, and I'm really keen to advocate and push for it to work with Ofcom and push it for its entirety.
Parven, I mean, there's been a particular focus on children, I think, certainly in the weeks following the verdict of the coroner in the Molly Russell case. And I think for me, the two things that really struck me about that was Ian Russell talking about the fact that the officers involved in the investigation weren't allowed to be on their own when they viewed the content Molly saw. They had to work in shifts. And yet this was content that was not just seen by a vulnerable young girl, but actively promoted by platforms to her, that was data profiling her vulnerabilities and then deliberately feeding them with content that they thought she would engage with as part of the business model of the company. I think your views of the work you do, because I think it's absolutely right that companies are held to account for the systems they've created for their own benefit.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the online safety bill, there are quite good things that the bill is doing. For example, criminalizing cyber flashing and also banning of illegal material. But at the same time, there is still a lot of gap in the bill when it comes to protecting children online, especially like what you've mentioned earlier, that comes under legal but harmful content, which is the big gray area in the bill. Research by NSPCC shows that children that have experienced legal but harmful content, they experience high level of anxiety and low level of self-esteem. And when it comes to the case of Molly Russell, when the coroner Andrew Walker questioned Elizabeth Lagoon, an executive of Meta, whether the content that was viewed by Molly is deemed safe to be children, her answer is yes, it is safe. Now, we are passing the obligation to social media companies to define what is legal but harmful within their platform, to conduct a risk assessment, and then come up with the tools that they're going to use to tackle those problems. Essentially, what we're doing right here is that we are telling social media companies to check their own homework. And I do understand, the regulators, whoever's behind the bill, is working hard to tackle this legal but harmful content. But what we have right now is not enough to protect our children online. The other problem as well when it comes to children's safety in this bill is also when it comes to age verification as well. Currently, what the bill is doing is that when it comes to adult content, each company will have to assess the likelihood for a child accessing their website. Now, why is it that a company are the one that are supposed to assess that? If a child has to put in their age on say Pornhub that comes up on first page of Google, they can easily go to page 10, page 20 and other places. Age verification on adult site should be for all adult websites, not just for companies that will actually come up and say, hello Ofcom, I think my child might be accessing this site and I will spend millions of dollars to put in age verification, because no company will actually do that. The other problem with the bill as well is when it comes to gaming as well. Loot boxes is completely excluded from the bill. Now, Children Commissioner published a report that 93% of children in the UK are gaming. The research by University of Plymouth and Wolverhampton found that loot boxes are structurally and psychologically similar to that of gambling. By excluding loot boxes from the bill, we are essentially grooming our next generation to be gamblers by having so many children which are currently gaming. So I think the bill is a step forward. The bill needs to come across, but there are still a lot of gaps in the bill that we need to address if we really want to make UK the safest place for children to be online. So yeah, that's my view currently on where the bill currently stands when it comes to children's safety.
Like I'm I'll just come back a couple of things there, but I might ask Jon to come in and give a view from Ofcom of things you set out. Because the loot box is being dealt with separately by the government, so was never part of the regulatory framework of the online safety bill. And indeed, the online safety bill isn't there to regulate everything on the internet. But loot boxes was dealt with as part of the gambling review, and the government has already put forward some proposals on how it would address that. On age gating, it applies to any site that has adult content on it. So if you have adult content on your platform, then you need to demonstrate how you can stop children accessing it. Now, for some social media companies, this will be easier than others because Meta already have quite strict policies on that. Twitter don't. So Twitter will have to apply. They'll have to work a lot harder to demonstrate how they would do this, or they can obviously get rid of the adult content. But Jon, I mean, how do you think Ofcom's going to approach the challenges that Parven set out?
Well, I mean, the first thing I say, that these are clearly really important challenges, and I mean, for us, I think protection of children is going to be one of our absolute priorities. I think when we're talking about legal but harmful content, it is important to distinguish between legal but harmful content to adults and to children. The bill treats those two things differently. And as regards protection of children, our reading is that the bill does absolutely give us the power to ensure that the platforms are taking appropriate and proportionate measures to protect children from age-inappropriate content, even if that content is legal. And we will be focusing on holding them to account for doing that. I think the example of age gating is an interesting one. So we'll be consulting next autumn after the relevant secondary legislation passes on our approach to protecting children online. And I would imagine that age verification, including on adult sites, will be a big feature of what we talk about there. I expect it to be, without prejudice to what that consultation says, I expect it to be an area where we take quite a firm line. I'd note that we've already made some progress in that area with our VSP regulation. So I think OnlyFans, an adult website with which many of you will probably be familiar, have recently introduced age verification on their sites. Off the back, I believe, of sort of structured engagement with Ofcom in the context of VSP regulation. So it's an area where we've seen some progress, albeit not enough, in relation to the VSP regime, and it's an area I'd expect us to be pushing quite hard once the relevant secondary legislation in relation to priority harms to children passes next year.
I think the OnlyFans example is a good example of how you can, if you're going to have platforms where there is adult content, you have to create a pretty high wall around it, to stop children getting in. And that is technically possible if you choose to do that, but it's a different way of running the business. I mean, Sharon, so far we've spoken about, I think, sometimes the lack of transparency around the way online social media companies manage their affairs, the way they try and tackle with these issues. I mean, do you have experience of trying to speak to the companies about this, to try and talk to the big platforms about the concerns you have and why they're not changing?
I mean, I personally haven't had any direct contact with anyone that works at the big social media companies, but I've done a lot of conversations and speeches in schools, especially GCSE and younger age children, about what they do when they experience any form of online trolling and abuse. And it's the same platform and direction that I take. But when it actually comes to reporting harmful messages and harmful content online, actually, because it doesn't breach any guidelines, even though it technically does in their terms and conditions, they're reluctant to take it down. If I, for example, one of the last messages that I'd reported was quite racial and explicit in nature, quite sexually violent, and the user was allowed to continue and actually, we were talking about OnlyFans. Obviously, that is not just an adult content website; it's about 60% adult content. But speaking to OnlyFans adult content creators, it's one of the safest platforms they feel or place to be online, because you have to age verify, because you have to put your name to your account. I'm not saying that everybody has to, explicitly say who they are, but there's no hiding behind who you are on these platforms. There's little to no trolling. And the company are very adamant to protect the people that use their platform. Whereas I feel like because other platforms such as Meta, Twitter are so big, they're no longer they're no longer concerned with it. I mean, we've seen articles in recent days since Elon Musk took over Twitter that the use of racial slurs such as the N-word have gone up by 500% because people are now testing the boundaries of freedom of speech. We're not saying that everybody, well, majority of the people I can probably guarantee are not entitled to use that kind of language. So, you know, at the moment, they're reluctant to take anything down. And if they do, it's too late. The content's gone viral.
And of course, you know, with things like that, you're testing not just content moderation, but also the recommendation systems built into it as well. If the frequency of those words is high enough, it triggers active recommendations. So, you know, then that is not a freedom of speech issue. That is a business decision to, you know, to trend racial abuse. Parven, I mean, from what you said before, I mean, some people have said about the online safety bill, it's taken a long time to get here, and I sort of sense in the way your opening remarks, you know, your frustration about that too. But I think it also highlights, because it's taken a long time, it highlights in some ways why it's particularly necessary, because we've been debating this for a long time. The companies know what the frustrations of government campaigners and other people are. They could have put remedies in themselves, but they haven't. I mean, do you think from your work that the companies will ever change unless the law makes them?
I think the problem is the company probably don't feel the incentive to change unless there's a regulation that would force them to change. And we have sort of, what we kind of notice is that whenever there is a pressure for a company to make a change, it's mostly a tick in a box that is being implemented more than an actual change. So for example, like if I try to, you know, search for hashtags like you know, eating disorders and stuff like that, pneumonia hashtags and things like that, the only thing that I would get is that this content might be disturbing, click continue if you'd like to view it, or get help. You know, I mean, imagine if I'm a 13-year-old, I would just click continue easily. You know, putting in measures which is just a tick in a box is just not enough to protect a child on these kind of platforms, because at the end of the day, these platforms were created not for children. But unfortunately, now we have children who are actually using it and companies who are profiting from their data, from their information, from their time. So to answer your question is, I don't think that these platforms will ever change unless there is a bigger force that will make them change.
I mean, it's interesting because in a way they were created for children, because you know, I mean they always set out with the ambition that children should use them, but it would seem that they've allowed these platforms to develop in ways that have made them less safe as time has gone on, and particularly the way data is gathered and used to curate that experience. And I mean, Jon, I wonder if I could ask you that, you know, from Ofcom's point of view, I mean, how important is it, do you think, to have that strong working relationship between Ofcom and the ICO in particular around the way data is used? Because we talk a lot about AI systems. Actually, one of the best live experiences of AI that most people have in this country is AI-driven recommendation tools of social media, which obviously is a data engineering process as much as an editorial one.
That's a really interesting question, Damian. And I mean, I think that cooperation with the ICO and indeed with other regulators like the CMA is absolutely fundamental to us. You know, there are lots of sort of intersections, synergies, and some potential tensions as well between online safety regulation, data protection regulation, and competition regulation. I mean, age verification is an interesting case in point, where there are some questions from a sort of data protection law perspective about appropriate protections for privacy when people are doing age verification. So we think collaboration with other regulators is really important, and to that end, Ofcom, the ICO, and the CMA and the FCA have founded the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, or DRCF, where we basically get together and sort of discuss how best we can collaborate on the intersections between digital regulation in our specific fields. So it's an area we're quite focused on. Funny enough, I'm meeting the ICO next week to discuss our codes of practice.
One of the challenges, I think, around child protection is on age verification, and Parven, you brought this up at the beginning, is what you base verification on. Because it was harder with children, because children don't have credit cards. Well, hopefully they don't. Children have the same sort of robust sort of ID, and the sort of ID that you might that children do have. Like they have an NHS number. They have. You could use facial recognition scanning techniques to try and guess how someone is. But many people find those invasive and wouldn't necessarily share that sort of data from children. So I think this is why this has been one of the challenging areas. I just wondered if, Parven, you had any thoughts on, you mentioned age verification, age gating, about for children, what you think an appropriate way to deliver that would be.
So I don't think that this is the perfect answer, but for example, Yoti, they use a facial age estimation. So you take a picture and then, using their algorithm, they can, sort of find out the age of a person that's signing up. I don't think that's 100% accurate, because I'm sure people are smart enough to, Photoshop their faces and stuff, but I don't know whether it goes as far as from the picture they sign up to the picture they post, whether they're then able to sort of make that difference. But that is one that I'm aware of. Now, I don't have the answer on what is the perfect sort of age estimation system that you can use, but I would assume a facial age estimation could be a starting point. Might not be 100% accurate, but whatever layer you put into to prevent a child from signing up is just another layer of protection at the end. But again, it comes at a cost whether you want to share your child's image or not. But if they're already signing up on social media, their images are going to be up there anyway.
So final question for me, and then I can see some hands in the room. We'll take some questions from the room. But Sharon, just a different aspect, but something you mentioned earlier, I wanted to ask you about is on anonymity, because it's certainly, it's not exclusively true that that people who are, the abuse comes from anonymous accounts, and it can come from people in their own name, and indeed people prosecuted for it. And I remember speaking to Nina Jankovic, who recently had a role looking at on disinformation, working with the American government, and been a campaigner on this, said that she'd received abuse on LinkedIn, which I think was showed that some people are pretty shameless in what they do. But what do you? I'd be interested if you have thoughts on, to what extent should anonymity be, a right or a privilege on social media?
Just quickly going off what Parven said about age verification, I think that we can't expect children to verify their age, but I think certain platforms, if the platform can identify that accounts are posting harmful content to children, to access that content, you need to age verify yourself. I could name about 10 people that post explicit content on Twitter that has no age verification whatsoever and is accessible by anyone over the age of 13, terms and conditions wise. So that page should be age verified, I think. In terms of I've received harassment and trolling on LinkedIn as well. That's not something that surprises me. I think that it's hard to say where anonymity should be allowed and not allowed, because there are people out there that do use blank profiles for their own protection and safety. I know in aspects of victims of domestic violence do use blank profiles, but it's one of those things that's really hard to control, because as soon as you report a page, if it gets taken down, it's not that hard to set up a new email address to make another fake page. So I think it's really challenging, but I don't know. It's one of those things, again, whether you ID somebody about setting up a platform page or not, regardless of whether they have to use their name. I don't have a perfect answer, and I wish I did.
I think it is. I think that's fair. I don't think it is a question with a perfect answer. I think when I was chairing the joint committee on the bill, where we came out was that there are good reasons why people want to be anonymous, and we should respect that. But anonymity shouldn't be a shield for abusive behaviour. And I think as long as the platforms can readily share data and information about accounts with law enforcement officers when pursuing cases, then and people know that they will be identified. I think the companies have got enough data to identify everyone on their platforms, pretty much, or if they're bot accounts, then they could kick them off. Bots don't have First Amendment rights in America or freedom of speech rights here. So, right, questions from the floor. Gentleman caught my eye first, and then you, sir.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Andrew Campling. I'm a consultant in the tech sector and also a chair of governors at a school. I'll ask you a similar question to one I asked Lucy Powell just now. In schools, we have a requirement to operate effective content filtering. Some of my work in the Internet Standards Fora, standards are being developed which will, as one effect of them, bypass that content filtering, be that in schools or indeed in homes for parental controls. And I think part of the issue is, unlike with the IGF, the sort of tech standards body, the Internet Engineering Task Force, isn't multi-stakeholder in the way it operates. So it's mainly dominated, funnily enough, by the tech sector. There are very few representatives from civil society, even less from governments, none that I'm aware of and involved in the fora. In fairness, the UK government is one of the few exceptions to that. And it would be really helpful to get more people that are not from the tech sector involved. And I just mentioned that the ITF meets 3 times a year in person, and it meets next week in London for the first time in several years. That's perhaps a more effective way than age verification is things like content filtering. But the sort of standards community, the sort of tech sector, is actively trying to bypass that. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that and whether that should be brought into scope for things like the online safety bill, and should politicians pay more attention to the nitty-gritty of how the tech works?
I think it's a good question. I might ask Jon to come on that from an Ofcom point of view. I think it's sort of, I've always seen the way the bill works is that when the companies do the risk assessments with Ofcom, there are choices I think they can make. They could build in very good like upstream solutions, which make it very easy for people to screen out certain types of content, help the user experience. Doesn't mean, of course, that content's not there. It just means someone can't see it. And in some cases that won't be enough. I think on the illegal priority legal harms, and we want the companies to go further. But I think the companies can look at what systems they can build in to mitigate. And I think hopefully Jon would agree with me here that the bill is not purely a content moderation bill. It's a systems bill, and there are different ways systems can work to deliver different outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll totally echo that, Damian. I mean, I think that we're not looking to take a sort of one-size-fits-all prescriptive approach here. I think our view would be that platforms should assess their risks in the round, including any risks arise from the standards they use, and put in mitigations that sort of tailored to that risk profile. So it isn't one size fits all. I mean, I very much agree with what Damian says there. On your specific question about standards, I'm not a technical expert, so I'm not going to overreach by giving a massively fulsome answer. But what I would say is, clearly, I think standards are very important. I think, you mentioned the UK government becoming more active in this area. I think it's an area where Ofcom has also become more active over time, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, I was recently, I spoke at the opening of the AI Standards Hub, which is being run by the Alan Turing Institute. Now, I think it's quite interesting to look at the work they're doing or will do there in the context of this debate as well, because you might say, in terms of good ethical standards, is making race hate a data feed for newsfeed on Facebook an ethical thing to do? And I think in terms of, I don't think we should be trying to regulate every aspect of the way AI works, but to set standards and priorities that people should work within, and then regulate the outputs based on those standards, I think is a sensible approach, because a lot of what we're talking about here is really the data inputs and the relative priority they get. And we've seen that the companies play with that all the time. We saw the case that Frances Haugen spoke about the US presidential election, where Facebook decided to favor trusted news sources over civic groups during the presidential election, which is a very different outcome. And when they changed it back, it produced a very different outcome again. So let's not pretend that this is all set in stone. It's constantly being played with, but there are no particular external standards against which those decisions are judged. Sorry, did anyone else want to come in on that question? If not, we'll go to the gentleman at the back.
Oh yes, my name is Kieran McCarthy. So Damien, I recognise that you've been sort of shepherding this complex, difficult process for some time. So I'd like to talk to you about the hardest part, which of course is legal but harmful. What have you learned during that process? And if you are able to just create your perfect version of legal but harmful, what would it look like? And then related to that, Jon, you will get things wrong. Ofcom will get things wrong. So what's the feedback loop that you're constructing, and how will you do things differently to how regulation has been done in the past? Bear in mind the internet is a very different animal.
So I would characterise the journey of the bill is the bill becoming more and more specific as it's gone along. If you think when the draft bill was published in April 2021, it was still very much based on the idea of the general overarching duty of care the companies had, which was a kind of catch-all, saying sometimes we know what bad looks like, sometimes we can't foresee what it is, but we know when we see it, and therefore you have that as a guiding principle. And the specific area is only really related to the things they have to do now, which is deal with child abuse images and terrorist content. It made that a proactive responsibility rather than a reactive one as it currently is, but was much more general in scope. I think what if you go through the process of what the Joint Committee has done, and I think what the government's been looking at on freedom of speech questions more recently, is to say actually it is better if you can be much more specific with the companies. What are the priority offences within scope? So to take harassment, incitement to violence, racial hatred, write those offences on the face of the bill. People can see what's in scope. The companies can understand what those offences are. We can look to the criminal law. So if you take the question of the abuse of the England footballers after the final of the European Championships, it was an event that was foreseen. It had been discussed with the companies. They were supposed to have a plan in place to deal with it, where they failed, and in fact their recommendation tools were amplifying the content, and people were prosecuted under existing race hate law for what they posted. If we look at the recent case involving Jeremy Vine, where someone has been prosecuted under stalking legislation for their behaviour, they were coordinating on social media against an individual. There are offences that exist in law. We understand what the thresholds are, and you can create a regulatory system based on those priority areas of harm, and Ofcom then has that to work from with the companies to say, this is the level that we think is a problem. We want you to be proactively looking for content like that and mitigating it. And mitigating can be, it can be a range of things, from, not amplifying that content to deleting the account that's posted it. So, and they can discuss with Ofcom where those triggers would fall. So I think you've got a specific area, then bringing in existing offences in law, so it's clear what you're talking about. And the other thing is transparency and accountability on the terms of service. So if companies say, in terms of what the adult user experience will be, these are the things they do. So if they say we don't tolerate hate speech, well, okay, well, how are they defining it? How are they enforcing it? And they've got to agree with Ofcom what those things would be. And then Ofcom has the power as well to see whether they're really doing it or not. So I think there you bring in specific offences in law written onto the face of the bill, which if Parliament feels is not covering all the things that need to be covered, Parliament can always, through legislative process, add to that list if it wants to in the future. You're making the companies accountable for their terms of service, and you're empowering someone to enforce it. So in all those areas, what we've done, I think, is move away from general safety obligations, which really end up being, hard to define, and I think hard to enforce as well. If we say there was something bad on a platform, that someone might say, well, we think you failed in your duty of care, and Ofcom come in and try and regulate them on that basis, or even fine them on that basis, I think it's quite easy for a company to appeal that and say, well, you say we breached the duty of care, but you didn't specify what exactly that will be in this scenario. There are some areas where you have, and some where you haven't. So I think that clarity, being more specific, is helpful for the regulator and the platforms, and users understand as well what things are in scope and what they can and should expect. I would say for the future, this bill, I think, the passing of this legislation, the creation of the codes of practice that Ofcom will do, is still part of what I think will be a dynamic process. I think we'll be coming back to this. Things will happen in the future that we will feel, well, maybe that's not covered adequately. Therefore, we need to consider bringing new offences in scope. The metaverse is a user-to-user experience, so it's in scope of the legislation, but enforcing that legislation in a real-time live speech virtual environment might be harder, and so there may be things we need to build into that, or that could be looking at the AI that drives it and the standards there, or the ability of people to capture their experience, their live experiences. So as people's interactions online change, we'll need to make sure that the legislation keeps pace. But I would say that's the is the answer to your question. I think is that I think making the bill more specific, and I think that is, and then with legal but harmful, I think you're avoiding then what people have been concerned about, which is subjective judgments on speech. What the bill does in a way is it says to the tech platforms, you set your own terms of service, we'll hold you to account for them. The minimum safety standards have to at least meet where the law is, here. So we've got laws on inciting racial hatred, inciting violence. So your safety features have got to at least cover that. And then beyond that, what you do is up to you, and we'll hold you to account for it. And I think, then I think you're saying to users, it's really like the terms of service are like any kind of consumer protection, which is, does it do what it says on the tin? And we use the law to set the threshold areas. And I think that is how you address, I think, the legal but harmful question by being more specific. But Jon, if you want to.
Yeah, I might come in on the second part of your question about feedback loops. And I think because you're right, no one's perfect. We will inevitably get things wrong. I think that for me, in terms of feedback loops, my response is threefold. So I think three things matter here. So I think metrics, ex post analysis, and iteration. To the first of those points, we do a lot of research on harm online, and our board is really focused on us having across the piece sort of clear target outcomes, real focus on metrics and measuring what we've achieved. At the same time, complementing that, our team of economists does a lot of ex post analysis, trying to unpick what the impact of regulatory interventions are, and from those two things, so from looking at the our research and the metrics generated by it, and whether harm is sort of going up or down in particular areas, and looking at the sort of econometric analysis and connecting those trends to regulatory interventions, we hope to get a sense of what works and what doesn't work, and where we see things that are working, we'll do more of them. Where we see interventions that haven't had the impact that we desired, we'll look to change approach. So I think that sort of very measurement focused, and research focused, data driven approach to regulation will be really key in ensuring we do have those feedback loops that you're referring to.
Lady there, yes.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. My name is Jacqueline from Global Partners Digital. I had a couple of questions. One of them was about what you were just saying, Damian, around the tensions between legal and harmful content. And I wondered what panelists' opinions are on the recent proposals to include encouragement to self-harm as a criminal offence. Thinking particularly if the legal but harmful content for adults portion of the bill is stripped out, then that would leave encouragement to self-harm not covered under the bill. And so just wondered if you think that that's the direction that the government's going to go in line with recent recommendations. And I had another question as well around the topic of age verification. We've mentioned OnlyFans and Yoti, and I just wondered, perhaps a question more for Ofcom, what kinds of safeguards Ofcom will be proposing, particularly for third-party age verification providers. In the example of OnlyFans, I believe they currently use 3 third-party age verification providers, and users aren't informed on verifying their ages, which provider is doing the work, and therefore don't know which privacy policy applies to the data that the user is giving in that transaction. So just curious to hear how you think privacy standards can be upheld and what Ofcom's plans are in that regard. Thank you.
Well, if I start on the legal but harmful area, I mean, I think legal but harmful, in terms of the bill as it currently stands, what it actually means is that companies can be risk assessed by Ofcom for legal but harmful content. So on self-harm, you could take a range of, and so what that means Ofcom can do is produce research and demand evidence and information from the companies about it. The legal but harmful provisions have never been an enforcement mechanism. There's never been a provision in the bill that means Ofcom can take enforcement against legal speech. So I think the enforcement areas are really around child protection, priority illegal content, and terms of service. I think the question then around self-harm, which I think is a real problem, is do we have the right law in place to do it? So I think what we need to do, and what the Law Commission recommended, is actually looking at how you create new definition in law around promotion of self-harm and suicide. And the legislation we had never envisaged a case like Molly Russell. I mean, really, it was designed about a much more immediate impact on someone that might lead them to someone's influencing the decision for them to take their life. So I think that's what we have to look at, is those offences. And I know there's been discussion within the government about how you define those offences, and then they more easily sit within the priority of legal harms as set out in the bill, and it's quite clear there's a legal threshold for them. But do you want to come in on other bits?
Yeah, I mean, on your second question around safeguards in relation to age verification, I mean, I think I'll dodge that a little bit. So, I mean, we are. It's a really important question. We are planning on consulting on child protection, including on age verification, next autumn, after the secondary legislation defining priority harms to children has passed. And I think we'll address questions there, around age verification, safeguards, etc. I don't really want to sort of preempt that because the work's ongoing. What I would say is this, coming back to Damian's earlier point, I think this is an area where, the ICO clearly has, an important role and an important voice. And I think that what we'll be looking to do over the coming year via the DRCF and via our sort of bilateral engagement with the ICO is to engage with them to sort of explore these questions around privacy safeguards.
So, Sharon Palmer, did you want to come in on age verification or some of the other issues in principle?
I think you've kind of covered that, because I mean, obviously, the dream for me, a good internet for children would be, 13-year-old just can't sign up without lying and ticking that they are above 13-year-old, and between the 13 to 18-year-old, that they are better protected online, because currently what we see is that a lot of, like, for example, like TikTok and all these other companies, they've all come up with like digital well-being tabs where you find it and then you tick your screen time or whatever restriction you want in place where children can opt for parents. But I sort of feel that those kind of privacy settings should be the standard rather than having an opt-in option. We should have an opt-out option where when we sign up on social media platform, we've got all of those boxes checked in for us, and then we later on decide what we want to view. But right now everything is just kind of gone the other way around, and I just sort of feel that obviously, with the bill being, one step forward towards all of this, there are still a lot of things that still needs to be done. And age verification, I guess, is just one of those quite a hard place to be. Sometimes I wonder, we can send a man to moon and create a second world in metaverse. Why can't we crack this one, which seems rather simple but somehow not?
I've seen a few hands, so gentleman at the back there first.
My name's Philip Ingleson. So I've been working in and around the internet since it was just called email, and I work for an outfit called Orbit, which trains doctoral students and people in responsible innovation. So, but my question, I guess, is thinking about some of the technicalities. We rightly criticise the big internet platforms that a large part of their business model is encouraging. Basically, what the AI, the artificial stupidity, I think it should really be called, to send people sites, links to sites that the AI has decided that they will find interesting, even that could be extremely harmful to them. It's easy to say, well, they shouldn't do this, but there's nobody sitting there, in Facebook or wherever saying, we think somebody should be shown this piece of information. It's all being done by an algorithm. So I guess the technical question is, how can you actually technically enforce this? And that kind of on the back of this, also the question that these companies are mostly not operating in a UK jurisdiction. They're actually operating in different countries, mostly USA. Of course, you can, to a certain extent, control what companies that are accessed from this country can do. Important part of their business comes from the UK. But nevertheless, this is very much an international thing. So I'd also be interested to know what you're doing to work with other countries to coordinate these activities.
I mean, as you say, if Ofcom's enforcement powers, John may want to speak to this, relate to companies that provide services that are accessed in the UK. So it doesn't matter where in the world they're doing it from. On the AI, I think the companies are responsible for the products that they create. AI-driven recommendation tools was not part of the founding version of Facebook, or any other platform. It's a tool they've developed along the way because they think it makes the platform better to engage with. And I think they need to be held to account for the data, the way they use data that drives those recommendation systems, and whether that is appropriate or not, and whether that is creating bad outcomes or not, against the regulatory thresholds that are set. And I think it's then for them to decide. I think this is like the old story about the Ford car in the 60s, where if you drove into the back of it, the engine was in the boot. If you drove into the back of it, the engine blew up. And Ford had decided as a company that it was cheaper to settle claims individually than to recall the fleet of cars. And then when this was exposed, it all changed. And I sort of feel we're in an environment like that now, where the company's views on balance, AI recommendation creates better user experiences for the majority of users, therefore it is net positive. But I think it's our right as legislators to take the view that, well, actually there's a lot of harm there as well, and you're responsible for that too. And we're not going to say that the net positive means that it's all fine. That actually if you've got 20% of the users that are having a really rubbish time and are victims of quite bad abuse, then you need to fix that problem. And that's what the bill seeks to do. Jon.
Yeah, I mean, I would I'd echo all of that. I mean, I'll say something about algorithms, and then I'll come on to your point about international cooperation, if I may. So on the point around algorithms, I mean, I think the bill creates a duty for platforms to undertake a risk assessment. I think one of the things that I would envisage them needing to consider as part of that risk assessment is what risks do their algorithms give rise to, and where they identify risks. We would expect them to have a plan for mitigating those. As in relation to the to the largest platforms, we'll be sort of supervising them in a structured way. So we envisage we call it sort of supervisory approach to regulation. So specifically, what we mean by that is we envisage sort of regular structured engagement with the largest platforms. As part of that, I think we'll be scrutinising their risk assessments closely, and the plans for mitigating any risks identified in those risk assessments, including risks arising from their algorithms. As regards your second point on international cooperation and engagement, I mean, I agree that's really important. It's an area with our international team has been quite active in. I think we think it's important for three reasons. I mean, I think there's a point about wanting to avoid regulatory arbitrage. I think, as you alluded to, international cooperation can be with, like-minded democracies, and can be important and useful for sort of enforcement purposes, given the transnational nature of the internet. And I think it's also important because where possible, to reduce burden on business, we want to avoid unnecessary divergences between the UK's regulatory approach and the approach taken elsewhere. And with that in mind, we've been quite active in the international arena. We are in the process of establishing global digital regulators forum with the Australians, the Irish, and the Fijian regulator as the alongside us as the sort of founding members, and we hope that will grow over time. So I think we recognise the importance of international cooperation for the reasons I said, and it's something we're really quite focused on.
I mean, Sharon, on principles of this, I mean, when someone goes on TikTok, when you open the app, the first thing you go on is for you. So actually, the first experiences of content recommendation, I think the stats for YouTube is something like 70% of what people watch on YouTube, they don't search for, it's recommended to them. They take it from the next up list. I mean, and I think it's also true that the more on the harmful side, the more you engage with harm and extremism, the more you see of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the one thing actually that TikTok has started to bring in is the following tab. So actually now, in most recent times, I think the last time I went on TikTok was this morning, it comes up with your following before your For You. So you only see content for people you're following. Obviously, with the algorithm, especially with TikTok, we've seen a rise in quite harmful content creators. And I think there was one person in particular who created a separate account and said that within 2 hours after watching a video by a Mr. Tate, he was in a very deep hole of misogyny and hate and violent crime towards women. So that was with zero age verification. So it's a lot of users of things like Instagram have said they wanted to go back to what it was originally intended for, which is to look at people you're following and not to look at content that is recommended for you.
Yeah.
So just wanted to explain that we do have a few dozen followers online. It's a virtual forum as well, and through our partnership with the Internet Society, it's being live streamed, so we've got a few comments there. So a question really from Ian Corby, who for clarity comes from the Age Verification Providers Association, and his first question is around the fact that the child protection from pornography doesn't need any further legislation. It doesn't need any secondary legislation, and why has it been artificially delayed in terms of Part 3 user services? So it's a serious negative impacts on the mental health of children with attitudes towards sex and relationships, and doesn't need any secondary legislation. So why is it being delayed? And secondly, around Ofcom's overriding duty to take into account the size, capacity, and financial resources of sites. Does that mean that smaller sites are let off the hook in terms of enforcement and protecting the public?
I think on the in terms of the duties that would apply in terms of child protection in that case, for if there's platforms that are distributing adult content that could be accessed by children, then those safety duties apply to any platform, not a category 1 aspect. I mean, John might want to on the first part. I mean, John may want to speak about that on the first part as well. I think it is on sort of the system itself. I mean, obviously, Ofcom has to go through the process of assessing the risk and working with the companies on that before you trigger what the intervention needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those questions are very good questions. I mean, and the first thing I'll say is, just to reiterate the point that we think protection of children from age inappropriate content is of paramount importance, and it will be a priority for us. In terms of the question around delay, and dependency with secondary legislation. So this is quite knotty and technical, and Damian's probably more expert in it than me, given his role on the bill. But in essence, I think we can think of adult services as being divided into two types in the legislation. So there are what we call Part 5 porn providers. So services that actually produce pornography themselves, and then there are Part 3 porn providers. So services that host user-generated pornographic content, and in reality, the boundary there is messy, because some adult services will host both. But there's that distinction made in the bill, and there is a duty on Part 5 services, so services that sort of produce their own pornography, in primary legislation, to age gate that from the word go. So that comes in primary legislation. But the sort of any duties in respect of user-generated pornographic content and protecting children from that would hinge upon secondary legislation, because it's a secondary legislation where harms to children will be defined. So the sort of legislative vehicle that allows us to impose age verification restrictions in relation to pornography on Part 3 providers, so user-generated pornography, does hinge, as we understand it, on the secondary legislation. Now, that gives rise to the question: why don't you take action against the Part 5 providers from the word go? I think the response to that is really there is. Basically, that would just push the problem. That would just shift the problem. If you age gate those providers, children wouldn't stop being able to access pornography. They'd just move on to user-generated sites, to the extent that they were using non-user-generated porn sites at the moment. And a big area of challenge from the adult industry has been around the risk of creating a non-level playing field. So I think if we were to go out with proposals against Part 5 providers, we wouldn't achieve much. We'd just shift the problem, and we would create a sort of risk of very, very strong vociferous challenge from adult services around us creating an uneven playing field. And with that in mind, we think it makes most sense to take a sort of holistic approach and deal with all pornographic services after the secondary legislation in our autumn 2023 consultation. So hopefully that helps address the first part of your question. On the second point around proportionality, so I mean, proportionality is hardwired into the bill, and rightly so, but that doesn't mean that small services get a free pass. I think what it means is when we are thinking what is appropriate for a given service, we'll take into account the resources that that service has, but we will also take into account crucially the risk profile of that service. And if you have a service which is small but very, very, very high risk, then absolutely we would look to hold them to a high standard because of their risk profile. Conversely, if you've got two services that are both low risk, but one is a massive platform and the other is a small startup, then we would expect more of the big platform. So proportionality is key, but it absolutely doesn't mean that small services get a free pass where they're high risk.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. I think in practice, in terms of how the way this will work, high risk probably means illegal activity, activity under that would trigger the priority illegal harms offences regulations. And I think then Ofcom would have every right to go in and audit that company to see what was going on and take action against them, because they would. I think that level of concern will probably mean there's a fair reason to believe that is what is happening. So jump in.
Thanks, Damian. Glenn Tarman from Full Fact. I wanted to take us just back to the harm to adults area as well, and perhaps through the lens of harmful health misinformation. I think it's a good example where you don't want things to be criminal. You don't want people to be scared about what they're saying online. But if you look at the policies of the internet companies, they'll tell a good story about we're doing this stuff already. We're not bothered by this. But Meta has batted its COVID misinformation to its oversight board. I was in different stakeholder sessions. Actors like the WHO and others were speaking about the huge amount of content and promotion of stuff that violates their health policies. I was at another platform last week. They have so much noise in their reporting system, they struggle to find things that violate. And of course, there's plenty there. We provided them with a dossier of a British actor which was just pumping out health misinformation that violated their terms of reference, but they hadn't seen it. Millions of people had seen it, but they hadn't. So for me, it's a question really about how do we front load these areas of risk? I think health is one where if we take the view that they need to do nothing and there is real risk there, and we've taken too long with doing the health risk assessments, coming forward with good secondary legislation and so on, how do we front load some of these areas to make sure that British citizens will be better protected in ways that hopefully, certainly from our point of view, enhance freedom of expression as well, which we think is possible. The problem we see is like nothing happens and the hose pipe's still on and people are exposed to it.
I think it's, disinformation is one of the trickiest areas. As earlier on, I think the change in the bill has been to make it more specific. But this disinformation, you can look at the outputs. So disinformation is covered in terms of being a national security risk. So coordinated activity from hostile foreign states, that network activity would be within scope. I think platform policies, as you say, are often the area where it's mostly addressed at the moment. So I think the idea of platforms having to be open and honest about what those policies are and what sort of enforcement action they take and whether they do it consistently or not, I think is a good area. And then other things I think also come around the consideration of the self-harm offences too, because a lot of the areas of disinformation we would be most concerned about would be around either disinformation that encourages people to maybe like engage with extreme dieting, which could lead to self-harm and loss of life, or to take treatments for things like COVID, which could kill them. And then I think that it's not a matter of, you can look at some activities and say, well, it's not really a matter of debate. There's a clear public health implication here that's probably covered by some of the other offences that are in the bill. But I mean, John, do you have anything to add on disinformation?
I think you've covered it very well, Damian. I don't have masses to add, and I mean only to say, you know, picking up on your point, Glenn, about the services talking a good game but not necessarily playing a good game. I mean, I think that comes back to the provisions in the bill around enabling us to hold services to account for doing what they say they're going to do in their terms and conditions. So, you know, even where a piece of content is sort of legal but harmful rather than illegal, if services say that they are going to take that down, they're going to, you know, that it's prohibited on their services and they're going to take steps to remove it, then we'll be able to hold them to account for following following those terms and conditions. So I think that is an important route in to tackling the point you raised around people talking a good game but not playing a good game.
I think where you can define the harm that disinformation is causing. I mean, frauds and scams is an example. It's a form of disinformation, but it has a very clear definition. And then on the other side, we've got to make sure that the regulation doesn't become a sort of a way in which, let's say, the powerful seek to suppress the truth about them. You know, so you can imagine the Me Too movement, for example. I mean, you could then see a massive triggering of people saying these are false allegations about me that are being made, but actually these were people, you know, speaking up about something that had happened, and we're using a public platform to do it. And therefore, you don't want to, you know, people's own subjective judgments on what disinformation is you know, it has to be considered, I think, when we think about how that can be regulated. Sharon, Parven, do you have anything to add on disinformation at all, or as a subject?
Not on disinformation,
No,
but
no.
If you have any other questions, I would like to ask you a question.
Okay,
That's
fine. We've got time. I think we've got 10, 12 minutes, so I think we're okay. Would you ask me that question now?
Yeah, perfect. So one of the main reasons why I'm here is because so I recently announced that I'm one of Refugee's new celebrity ambassadors for the online safety bill in terms of from a violence against women and girls aspect. And given that the government have made a pledge to tackle violence against women and girls, talking on the legal but harmful content, as far as I'm aware, violence against women and girls isn't included as an online harm. But given the rise, you know, Lucy earlier was talking about Panorama's disaster deniers, about how conspiracy theorists can easily get blown out of proportion. We've seen with characters like Andrew Tate that the same thing happens with misogyny. So in your opinion, do you think that violence against women and girls should be included as an online harm? And if you don't, then why not?
Well, in terms of how the bill is structured at the moment, I mean, what you say is it deals with violence against everybody. You know, so the incitement of violence and violent acts against people is on the list of the list of priority legal harms in the bill. And as women and girls are far more likely to be the victims of violence and abuse, so they will be the group. They will be the people that are the most that benefit the most from it. The question is why in the schedule of legal offences, priority legal offences, why is there not one that's specifically about violence on women and girls within that? And that's simply a function of the way the law is written, in that the offences are created against to benefit any citizen or to protect any citizen from that action, and there isn't a particular piece of legislation that only addresses violence against women and girls, because it addresses it for everybody. So that's why, in terms of the way the bill is structured, it's not listed there. However, I mean, I would think that for Ofcom, in preparing the codes of practice, Ofcom will do so well aware of what misogyny looks like online and the way women and girls are targeted with abuse online. And I think in the regulatory codes that can be reflected in those. But it's not a downgrading of the seriousness of the issue. It's just that it's stressed in a slightly different way. John, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of amplify the point you were getting into around how Ofcom will deal with this. So I mean, this is an area we really care about, and our research shows to be a real problem. I mean, I think you know, our Online Nation report, which each of them might be going to talk to later on, showed that women are, you know, feel materially less comfortable being themselves online than men because of the harassment to which they're disproportionately subject, and that, you know, for certain harms, you know, women are much more likely than men to sort of experience those harms. You know, back in June when we published the Online Nation report, our CEO Melanie Dawes was very clear that we saw this as as a really serious issue, and one which we expected, the platforms to focus on. So I'd expect it to be an area of focus for us. I think on the bill, the way we view it, there are a number of hooks in there to tackle sort of gendered aggression online. So I'd note intimate image abuse is a priority offence under the bill, as cyber stalking and harassment, and I think sexual exploitation online. So there are a number of offences there that, as Damian says, are listed as priorities that are most likely to disproportionately affect women. And I think, where those are called out as priority harms in the bill, we have the tools really to expect the platforms and to hold the platforms to account for putting in place appropriate systems for dealing with them.
I think it's right. I think if you look at the change that will come, hopefully, with the new legislation, where you've got obligations then for the companies to stop stop the incitement of violent acts, harassment, stalking, the sharing of intimate images without consent, cyber flashing, and those range. I think what the bill does, it takes those offences, it makes the companies agree with Ofcom what they will do to combat all of those things. Gives Ofcom the power to take enforcement action against them all as well. And I think in terms of the international agreements we've set up in the conventions around addressing violence against women and girls, that would address the issues that we've committed to address. I think if Ofcom came back to us, to the government in the future, and said, well, we think we need extra power in this area, then I think Parliament would grant that. But I think that the basis of drafting it has been as far as possible to be as specific as possible based on existing legislation that we have. So that's just in terms of. But I think it's as Jon has said. I would say that I've got a 15-year-old daughter, so I talk about this quite a lot with her, and this is my views of girls in particular are girls, but I think particularly younger girls are subject to the worst kind of behaviour online as a frequent daily part of being online, and that's my ambition for this bill is that it addresses that head on.
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to cut the discussion short. I think that this discussion just shows that we could have sat here for a few more hours to really get to the meat of the online safety bill. But I want to make sure everyone has a chance to have a quick break, grab a coffee,